Okay, good afternoon, everybody. We are starting our last session now, and it will be a panel discussion with Peter Stevens, Virginia Rutledge, Nora Nagy, and Ann Temkin. I only want to introduce briefly Ann Temkin. As you know, she's the chief conservator at MoMA for painting and sculpture, and a curator. And actually my point was that in this case, curator means courageous, because she did not let me go with my request to lead this panel. We had a different idea first, which she would speak about, and then she totally stuck with me and she said, I do whatever you suggest, and I'm very happy that Ann put together this amazing panel, and we are very excited. Okay, so.
Welcome everybody to the last session of the day, and I'm happy that we are going to leave for tomorrow some of the thornier problems that came up this afternoon, full of completely unanswerable questions, like when artists tell you on different occasions completely self-contradictory things. And instead we are bringing in the law in Virginia. And that wasn't really our first plan, as Christian just hinted at. It came about rather unexpectedly. What happened was that we were going to have some representatives of a certain artist's estate on this panel. And then in March, that estate called Christian to say that those people couldn't be on the panel or participate in the symposium. So of course, at first you think, oh, this is really bad. And then you think, oh, this is really good, because it gave us a great topic, which was that of authority. And who has the authority today in circumstances like this to allow relevant players in all of these questions we're dealing with to speak up, and who has the authority to not permit them to speak up. And so to bring us back to the kind of triangle that Loretta outlined this morning with museums, academics, and the market circulating around a certain work of art, we're adding as further points, now it's becoming more like a pentagon, foundations and conservators who aren't parts of museums. And so we have with us Nora Nagy, who is the modern sculpture conservation company embodied here. She's also a freelancer researcher with the Whitney, and has a great deal of experience in particularly minimalist and fabricated sculptor. She has a book coming out this year on the materials of Donald Judd, which I'm probably waiting for more eagerly, that I could win the prize for eagerly awaiting this
It's
book.
on Amazon, you can pre-order it.
Hear that? And Virginia Rutledge, who is in private practice advising especially artists' estates and foundations from the point of view of an attorney who had been an art historian and curator at LACMA, and then a general counsel for Common Cause?
Creative Commons.
Creative Commons, sorry about that. I'm thinking of a Common Cause. And in the last few years has worked with several of the foundations that we've talked about today. And Peter Stevens, who has been for many years the executive director of the David Smith estate. And one of the questions that I know that you're going to help us with a little bit is, are there technical differences that actually have real impact between an artist's estate and an artist's foundation? There are a number of questions that I hope to cover with this panel that sort of broadly talk about how the authority and advocacy that an estate can represent or can designate on the behalf of the involved artist has an impact or doesn't have an impact on that person's legacy. And I think one word that everybody on this panel is very interested in chipping away at a bit is the word legacy, because that is a very broad and mushy term right now. And I think there's a big difference between promoting a legacy in sort of a vague general way and then really asking what is there that actually constitutes a legacy, because is it an object, is it an attitude, is it a body of reception, on and on and on. But before we get to that, I'm going to ask each panelist to say why they're on this panel. And we're going to start at that end with Nora. Because these are all, Christian was very generous in his introduction, but these are really, all three of you here are at Christian's invitation.
Oh, I actually should have asked Christian, why did he ask me to be here? I have two guesses. One, to talk dirty laundry. And the other one is, I think he was thinking that maybe I have experience on different fields. I am running for many years by now modern sculpture conservation, so I have a lot of experience in the US as well as in other countries, including Europe, in private practice. And I have the same, working at several museums, at the Tate, at the Canadian Conservation Institute, at the Guggenheim, at the Whitney, and several other shorter periods in different museums all over the world. And the same is happening working with foundations and estates. I am also currently working as a museum professional with estates and foundations, as well as a private conservator with estates and foundations in the US as well as in Europe. I would like to list a few things just to start with, what kind of instances conservators and in what kind of versions conservators are involved with foundations, because I don't think this has been listed, so I am just going to give a very short list of these things. The most common is when a conservator approaches an estate or a foundation because there is a particular treatment. I think nearly every conservator has experience with this, either as a private or as a museum conservator. Often happens, or at least I have experience with this, that when there is a bunch of objects or just even one, you call in either the artist or the estate, and you have to really physically be in front of the piece and talk about it. When this happens, I ended up a number of times with an interview which basically outlined some kind of legacy or some kind of guideline, which is extremely important and interesting. I had an instance which was interesting. The Whitney's collection has a significant holding of seagulls, and particularly the walk, don't walk, I had the major difficulty with. There were all kinds of graphic drawing lines on the base, and you remember the lamp is up, and the lamp obviously has the three lights. We only had black and white images. We didn't know if the lights were color. And the lights are actually flickering. We knew that too. But how often? How much? And which line on the base is really the artist? So I called in the artist's daughter, and we actually learned a lot, and we learned a lot of things which we did not learn also before, that he preferred to display this piece in dark or semi-dark, so the light has much more significance. So basically, when you deal with these things, you learn a lot, and in return, the foundation also learns a lot. These are very positive occasions which happen. There is also another way, which I think is very beneficial when a foundation approaches a conservator, either museum or private conservator, based on the conservator's specialty, that they have a problem they deal with. I very much encourage these occasions, and it happened to me that once an estate came to me that they know I am specialized for modern metals. Could I start really specializing the artist's work, because it's metals, it's modern, and they really need somebody. They did their research. I really encourage any kind of estate and foundation to do this. It's very exciting for a conservator, and both parties learn a lot. There is another one when, as a museum conservator, we often are responsible for exhibitions. So it happened that I approached specifically the Calder Foundation about a new concept of exhibition, which you probably have seen, the Calder Hypermobility, which very unreligiously decided that we will actually move the pieces, and this will be the theme of the show. It's kind of going against the conservation grain, but I thought about it a lot. And Calder is really an artist who was really immersed on thinking about motion. So after so many years of nothing moving on an exhibition, we thought it was really important. The foundation was tremendous support to us, actually, much more than we thought. And we ended up with an exhibition where we did not have damage and we didn't have incidents of the public touching. So there are a lot of very good instances when we can connect. There is another one when a conservator is involved with an estate making replica. We have been talking about replicas. Right now, I am very heavily involved with the Mike Kelly Foundation. One of Mike Kelly's major work is needed desperately a replica. That's the Mike Kelly, More Love Hours and Wages of Sin. The Wages of Sin is basically a sacrificial, the idea when you go into the church and before you pray, you lit a candle, and the candle is basically an offering. So the Wages of Sin is basically put together many candles as an offering. The piece is so frail and fragile that we cannot travel it and cannot exhibit it anymore. On the other hand, the piece is really one of the major works by Mike Kelly, and we cannot display it regardless how many requests we get. So we got together with the foundation, and we are going through a very difficult process because we cannot completely remake it as it is with candles. We also know from the estate that Mike Kelly was thinking about more permanent materials, but what does it mean, more permanent material for him? We have a completely perfect three-dimensional laser copy of the whole thing, so we could just 3D print it. But how do you 3D print a completely accidentally happening and just in the spur of the moment and the inspiration made piece, which has drop marks? The drop marks will be perfect in 3D, but it will be totally dead. So we have a lot of issues, and including legal issues, marching through, and it has been a while, marching through the whole process, which is sometimes painful for both of us, but it's very important. And this is, again, I think, a fairly new way of conservators dealing with foundations. There are others. I was fortunate enough to be, I think, one of the first ones when a foundation asked me to write care of metals on their website. And that was the Judd Foundation. I think it's a really wonderful opportunity for conservators to do that. And it's very unusual at the moment, and I think that website needs updated right now. But just the idea how much conservators can collaborate with foundations, I think really important. I was also the founding member of the Conservation Committee for the Donald Judd Foundation. I was doing that for about 12 years. It was a voluntary body of advisors, and we devised long-term policy for the foundation. We were trying to describe what is the legacy. We fielded a lot of specific conservation questions, and we did it worldwide, as well as we were providing daily advice for the foundation. We also managed and succeeded to establish the first conservator position at the foundation. It is amazing how much conservators can do. another thing which conservators few times do, and I again was lucky enough to do, I did a major analytical investigation on Nagy's metal works. I think several hundred works I analyzed with XRF, and the FTIR was done by Lynn Lee from the Getty. And part of this information will come out, only summarized one because it's so big, in the book. So I want to open up this discussion, how many opportunities and how different levels and meanings are ahead of us where conservators really can contribute to the field.
Fabulous. Virginia, you've been involved with conservators and foundations in some happy situations and some less happy situations, I guess, by definition.
Yes, and I'm going to answer the question, why am I here? By reading you, I'm not really addicted to my phone, but this is breaking news, Dateline today. Art dealers strike back at artist Katie Nolan in an increasingly philosophical legal dispute about a restored sculpture.
Yeah, great.
Okay. So I'm here for the fear factor, basically. And what I'd really like to do is quote two things said by other people today. First, Jeanette Rodensek, I have so much I want to tell you. Mm-hmm. And then Christian, relax. Okay? Maybe a little later we'll get into some more detail about why I think that's really safe advice to give you. I am a lawyer. You are not my clients, so this is not legal advice. But the basics of the rules that surround what you can and can't say are actually very simple to understand. And the good news is they all benefit our common project, which is to project into the future the authenticity of the artist's voice. That's why we're here. So I'd actually like to hear from Peter before getting into as much nitty-gritty as you'd like to on that.
Thank you. Well, I guess I'm here, Ann said why we're on the panel, to represent a certain type of artist estate, which was alluded to this morning. First of all, the term estate, as was pointed out, is legally used used inappropriately in America. So when we refer to the David Smith estate, we're using that, we're leaving out a word, and that was the David Smith estate. So when an artist's estate uses the terminology estate, they're referring to the works that artist left. It was legally in the United States an estate. It is no longer an estate once the family or whomever inherits it, takes charge. So, but we use that terminology because to distinguish between an estate and a foundation. Also, the reason I'm on this panel is I think I represent something else that was alluded to this morning, which is the idea that we are now in a time with the tremendous expansion of artist estates and foundations, mostly foundations. And there was a time when there was very little communication. There were very few artists' estates that could even afford to create structures and programs that could support the legacy of the artist. And not only when David Smith died, but when he died when his two daughters were 9 and 10 years old, and he left the entire estate, his work and everything else, to his two daughters. Clement Greenberg led 3 trustees who Smith appointed. That was in 1965. By 1979, when his daughters were meant to inherit this, was really legally a trust, they had become quite disillusioned and quite unhappy with the management that Greenberg had guided the estate with. Although he had done quite a lot of good, he had also done quite a lot of harm, and particularly he did harm emotionally. And that's something that estates deal with. It's about the person of the artist, a father, a wife, a husband, a daughter. These artists are people, and their families are people. And so these 2 young women were now going to take charge of this legacy. And at that time, I was married to Rebecca Smith. We were young, quite young, in our early 20s. And neither of these two young women wanted to deal in the world, even though it was a much smaller and less complex world than it is now, with this outward-facing aspect of their father. They wanted finally to recoup it. So with the three of us, created a structure in which we could honor their desire for the intimacy with their father's work and also create public, outwardly facing programs that would provide access and kind of celebrate his work. So we had to invent the wheel, or as we didn't understand then, and is so clear now, reinvent the wheel, because it's what every artist estate had to do. So I'm very, very happy to be on this panel, because I think it represents the fact that we're in a time now where the kind of communication and the kind of sharing of information that can benefit the complexity of where artists are now, where art is now, the complexity just that we've heard today and the few artists that have been mentioned of what their intent was and the different kind of permutations of how honoring and expressing their legacy is, that the fact that we're having open dialogue and to Virginia's point also, that we can kind of maybe relax now because we have security in numbers. If we all act a certain way, it will become the norm. And I think openness, transparency, communication that supports what artists have done, it will be in everyone's interest. And I'll just end with one philosophical premise that we took in the estate, which was that more voices are better than fewer. That it is not an estate, and this is our view, and other people have a very different view, as we've heard today. Our view was the more voices and the more kind of approaches you have, whether it's in terms of conservation, whether it's in terms of exhibition practice, whether it's in terms of scholarship, that these are what enrich and fight against the idea of preservation of a legacy, which means to contain and guard, and the kind of life-giving aspect of allowing art to keep living in the world and to keep finding fresh voices and fresh contexts. And this is one that I'm very happy to be a part of.
Yeah, I think to your point, I'm sure everybody here would agree with me that the thrill of today has come from as much the people who've spoken on the stage as the people in the audience being a group of curators, artists, conservators, foundation people, dealers, art historians. I'm even leaving out some. And when are those people all together in one room thinking about one thing? And I think the genius of that alone already takes this conversation from point A to point, I don't know, P, Q, or R, somewhere that far along. And then from there, it is you know, a state of anything's possible, though not everything's resolvable. But I wanted to go back to a concrete example with the David Smith, Clement Greenberg connection, which sort of sounded very moving to hear you just allude to the emotional side of what goes on with an estate. And I couldn't help thinking of where Clement Greenberg would be in today's climate. But let's talk about actual artwork modification. And I think this is a situation that all three of you can speak about. When David Smith was making his work, it perhaps in the light of the present moment may not seem as radical compared to a Judd or a Flavin with prefabricated materials and so forth. But his whole gambit to combine painting and sculpture in one thing was strange and certainly radical, and occasioned a great deal of misunderstanding, because was his painting part of his sculpting or not? And do you want to just begin to launch us on that?
Well, I think it is a good nexus because it connects all of our issues. It deals with conservation. It deals with the kind of the legal issues of who has the right to do what, and it deals with the idea of legacy management or kind of celebration of what we believe an artist's intention is and what their work, how their work should live in the world. It was also very informative. It was a kind of determining point, because one of the things that was most upsetting to Rebecca and Candida was going up every summer to what had been their home, their father's home, where they had spent the summers with him. He was no longer there. All of his sculptures were there, but actually they weren't all there, because every time they went, there were fewer there. These 3 were gone, those 5 were gone. And they were very, very upset to see this happening. At some point, quite a bit later, in the early 70s, Clement Greenberg decided that 5 sculptures that Smith had painted white, a monochromatic white, they bothered him intensely. And I intentionally put it that way because it was about him. He was the kind of person that he really felt the world should conform to the way that he thought it should be. So he had a lot of problem with Smith's desire to combine painting and sculpture. Early on, he championed some of those works, but it began to kind of go against his grain of his own personal aesthetic. So he took these 5 sculptures and had assistants, actually, of other artists who are friends of his, to come and strip the white paint off of 5 monumental sculptures. Actually, it was 5 of 8. There were 8 large sculptures that Smith had painted white, so it was a kind of random decision. And he had the pieces rusted. Rosalind Krauss found out about this because she was a protege of Clem's, and she was appalled, and she wrote an article about it, and started to gather research. Nobody would publish. No one wanted to say anything bad about Greenberg. It was only a brave publisher, Betsy Baker, who may be here, I saw her,
here.
yes, who published the article in Art in America and brought it to the attention of the world, really, and it became a huge scandal. And the art world divided into 2 camps: the Clem camp, supported by Bill Rubin at MoMA and other people, and the people that were supporting the integrity of the artist's work. It's funny that for us, and Rebecca, Candida, and I, this wasn't such a big issue at the time. It kind of preceded. I have to say, I first went to Bolton Landing in 1974, which was the year that article came out. I don't think I even was aware of it. We were so focused on so many other things. But the idea then that we had to start thinking about how David Smith's sculpture should be treated, and the conservation of other painted sculptures and how they could be cared for. Our first act was actually to build a building to bring the painted sculptures inside, so that at least they would stop weathering. And what's interesting now, sort of cutting to let some other people talk, is that the whole scandal of it is hugely important, and it raises really important questions. But in some way, I feel that it always has kind of framed the issue in a detrimental way to Smith, when I think, of course, those works were harmed. Thankfully, they were beautifully restored, and they live in the world now. There was an exhibition at Storm King last summer celebrating the works, the white sculptures in which they were shown. But it focused, for me, the importance of what Smith's aesthetic was, which was this idea of the integrity and the visual authority of sculpture, and the conservation of sculpture, When we first went to conservators to find out how we could conserve Smith's sculpture, every conservator we went to told us the same thing. I will sandblast it, and I will repaint it. And we just didn't know what to do. And finally, we found a kind of eccentric, wonderful, and probably many people here know him, painting conservator named Alan Ferenz, who said, these are paintings.
Yeah.
What's the big question? So we actually saw David Smith's work for his aesthetic innovation as a result of this kind of damage that had occurred. And so it really ultimately has led to a kind of quite positive outcome in terms of the preservation of David Smith's work and even the understanding of his intention.
Yeah. Do you want to fill in a little bit, Nora, on
Well,
that?
that's how we met, because I was preparing for the Guggenheim's David Smith exhibition with Carmen Jimenez, and she was getting a lot of painted surfaces, and I started to look at them, and many of them had some wax on it, many of them had some losses, and the first thing I did, walked over, and that's how I met Peter and the two daughters. The interesting situation is that the wax was on because by that time the tide kind of turned. And an interesting situation what happened very recently at the Whitney, if you remember, with the running daughter, the museum decided to put it outside, a painted piece, very nice, for the inaugural exhibition. It's about a 100-inch tall, painted, very lovely sculpture of a toddler daughter really trying to run. So we contacted Peter that it is going to be happening, and I really want to protect the paint. Well, in the process, we didn't only discuss how it will happen, but also Peter informed us that one of the braces, one of the elements, was attached later, which was completely new information for us. Anyway.
By David Smith.
Yes, yes, by David Smith, that's correct. And so we agreed that we will protect it for the time it will go out. Margot Delilo is here. She's the other one who was working on this. So we put an acrylic resin F10 on it to be absolutely sure that the paint, because the paint was in very good condition. Nothing problem with that. We protected with that. And then we put a cold wax on it. But we put it out. Peter was happy with it. Couple of days later, he comes back. Where was your place? You
Right.
saw it just
Yes,
from the other side. So what happens is it was on the eastern terrace. And Peter has a view to it when in the morning the sun really shines on it. And came back a couple of days later, it's too shiny. So we had to adjust the wax, again working together with the foundation. It is just the temporary protection what we put on, but even then, Peter was really careful about how does it look even in the highest light level.
Yeah.
So I think that's interesting and important, even for a temporary situation.
And how do you two work together?
Well, I can't tell you. And that's actually what I want to talk about, is some of the pernicious effects of the sort of extra legal operations that come into play here. I mean, something that both Nora and Peter pointed out very nicely is that the legacy is not simply created by the artist, and we all have investments. I mean, Rosalind had her investment, conservators have their investment. Yes. And to return to the nitty-gritty, which I was encouraged to do, what are the legal sources of authority for that? Well, Loretta Würtenberger pointed out very nicely this morning that we're in a very funny situation, those of us in this room who see our project as being global and in some ways, projected into the future, but law is jurisdictional. And it has different durations in different places, and that can really matter. For example, who could have said no and stopped the various things that happened? Who could have litigated Clement Greenberg is a really interesting question, because in the United States, the basis of authority for the Artist Foundation voice is going to come from two different possible places. One is from copyright. That's very limited because in the United States, the moral rights that attach to copyright die with the artist. They're not inheritable in any way that allows Candida or Rebecca or anyone else to have a say, basically. Foundations, though, also serve a public trust, so there's a slightly different wrinkle there about how they could be brought to account if need be, but by whom is really the question. So what I think is most interesting for a practical discussion is to recognize that what we are talking about is a social contract here. We are deciding what we're going to value and who gets to say with authority what's authentic and not authentic, which is why the Panza Collection project was so endlessly fascinating and so really, really important. So you had asked for some best and worst experiences. Is this a good moment for it?
Very good.
Okay, well, let me give you the best first, okay? One thing that I've enjoyed very much doing over the years of my private practice, and I haven't asked permission, so I won't name one of my most exemplary clients in this regard who's sitting in the room, but it's been fascinating to see how gallerists and dealers use the contract to supplement and sometimes help, like a good prenup, an artist or the foundation tease out with the collector or ultimate steward of the work what the work is, okay? Certificates of authenticity are not gonna cut it most of the time. If we don't have moral rights authority or legal authority in that sense, and we don't, again, in the US for the most part, what do? You rely on social norms, or you rely on a legal document. So it's been very heartening to me to see progressively thinking gallerists do things like build into contracts, well, even if legal moral rights don't apply, we would like you, the purchaser, to consider these and to act as if they did. And then build in mechanisms for perpetual discussion with the estate or the DBA estate, whatever that may be. Another positive example has been the increase in understanding that being the gatekeeper for documentation because you're worried about an image getting on a shower curtain is probably not in the best interest of the legacy. So contracts that really restrict the use of images and documentation, who's being served by that ultimately? Okay, so contracts that build in an understanding that fair use is an important process, an important part of the process of conserving our understanding of values in art is really great. Some museums, who shall remain nameless, push back on these things. They push back on these things because counsel are often very risk averse. I actually don't think that's the lawyer's job to be too terrifically risk averse. I think the job is to get to yes for whoever the client is. And if the client is the artist, this is where the estate and the foundation and the experts and the conservators all have a voice. So here's my worst example. NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, confidentiality agreements. What are these things?
We knew we had to get the Stormy Daniels aspect of the program in before the day came to a close.
You got it, right? So they can be very useful. They can protect innovation, right? They can also protect the secret source of the only factory that makes cathode ray tubes or a certain kind of fluorescent light fixture. Just saying. NDAs can protect privacy in the sense that they can protect victims, okay? But they also protect sexual predators, some of whom do have political ambitions, it turns out. So, just pause. What in that panoply of interests is served in our context by an NDA? In my experience, there's only one. I'm the one who usually puts up the slide up here with the $sign on it, because I think it's not scary to be realistic about this. The market is a huge player. The insurance companies are huge players, and it's really time to be talking about this openly in the interest of the art. So I thank you for having the courage to moderate this panel, and Christian for putting this together very much.
And elaborate a little bit maybe on the insurance side. The market side, I think, is very evident because if we were completely transparent about the restoration that certain works had gone through, obviously their sales appeal would drop. But how does insurance play in?
Well, one simple example is that depending on the story that's told, insurance will pay for your restoration or your conservation or refabrication or not. Okay? And depending on relationships with galleries and estates and auction houses, there can be a role in whether insurance keeps something on the market or removes it from the market.
Mm-hmm. So let's get into the question of legacy a little bit. I love this idea of legacy being something not about guarding, but about expanding. And you two had a case with some David Smith recently in terms of an artist who made small David Smiths.
Yes.
And the foundation was not so happy about those.
Well, that was a really unfortunate situation, and one I feel was really quite misrepresented, and I think it has to do with maybe a kind of a transitional moment. I think the importance of just of what you're talking about, of how much is at stake. What happened in that case was a young artist had made little replicas of David Smith sculptures out of kind of intimate materials, paper, and when I saw it, I called Vaga, which is the agency that represents David Smith's copyright, and I said, I really don't like this because we do not make any replicas or any miniatures, and we've been offered a lot of money to do so. We don't want that to happen. It will happen, when the copyright expires, but for now we didn't want that, and I really don't like it. So he said, okay, well I'll send her a letter and tell her not to do it. And so he did, and what happened is she was about to have a show at a museum, and the museum canceled the show. And I got kind of embroiled, and the next thing that happened was a couple of magazines, I don't know, I shouldn't say which ones, I don't remember, but printed this article, "Powerful Estate Squelches Young Artist." And it just became a kind of a disaster, one that I actually truly regret, because it was never our intention to actually censor the artist. In fact, we wanted to have a conversation with her. I did. We came to a really great agreement and said, do your work. I just wanted to make sure that it's credited properly and all of that. Then she went to the press and basically told another story, I guess. Yeah. And it ultimately was resolved. We did not want to, and we didn't take any legal action, and I don't think we had grounds to take legal action. It wasn't really a point of that. But I think that for me the salient point was how big what seemed to me to be a very little thing, a conversation. And I think now maybe that wouldn't even happen, even though it's a relatively short period of time, because we now know so much more what's at stake. When I said I didn't like it, I didn't know. I was naive. I didn't know that my saying that could become such an important thing. And it's also why people want to have kind of confidentiality agreements. In that sense, I should have kept my mouth shut, or spoken only privately if I had.
I have such a crush on him. Can you tell? It's just. Well, I actually wasn't involved in that. I was asked to get involved, and I didn't think it was necessary. I mean, it looked to me like the parties were figuring stuff out, because that's what civil people do. But I think that your point about it being a transitional moment is dead on. I mean, a lot of us, there are several really, really great art lawyers in the audience. I'm so glad you're here. This is kind of a made-up, invented field in some ways, and it's changed so dramatically. I mean, the thread, thank you for your introduction, which seems schizophrenic, I guess, to some people, but the thread for me has always been about the cultural politics around who gets to say, what the artist's voice is. And frankly, my experience with the politics of institutional structures in the form of the museum drove me to law school, looking for a little more, malleable of a framework and a practical framework. And it hurts me to hear stories like the one that led to this particular invitation to speak, because it's just so unnecessary. It's just so unnecessary for us to feel so scared and proprietary around the wrong things. I mean, let's fiercely defend the painted work, but let's not get so uptight, really, about, facts, historical facts.
Have you been in awkward positions where you've not been able to say things that you wished you could say, Nora, or that you couldn't be told things you needed to be told?
I think I would join Peter's story in a slightly different version. I think it is not, that's my bad story, okay? I still see traces of an old-fashioned, and as far as I am concerned, historical attitude, which I think is coming from this whole story how estates and foundations actually come to life. We know that whoever is the heir of the artist suddenly from one day to another becomes the estate and the authority. Now we also know that these people are not really trained for this, and many times they are completely surprised.
And don't even want it.
Yes. However, they say that they know the parent, the grandparent, and they really know, which I am absolutely sure is true to very many degrees. But they are not lawyers, they are not managers, they are not art historians, they are not conservators. So often what happens, and similar thing happens with foundations too, because my understanding is that an estate turns over to foundation when they want a tax break, and the heir becomes not one person or not just a family member, but several other members or friends of the artist, who could be a business person, who could be anything. And they again not necessarily have any specific trained interest in the art. They are not professional in what they are deciding about. So they also need, but they also act very many times as the authority and the only authority. So when it comes down to a conservator, and especially a conservator who is in private practice, they tend to see the conservator as a bench worker. Okay, come on, it's here, fix it. And they don't see the conservator as a professional who is theoretically, philosophically, historically, and technically prepared person who should ask, okay, where does this come from? What is the history of the piece? What is the context of all of this? And the conservator doesn't get an answer. It happened to me that they say, okay, here is something. I asked all of these questions. I didn't get any answer. And they said, fix it in a week. And I said, sorry. Yeah. There are a few cases still like this, and I think it greatly hinders conservators' potential help and potential contribution to the general cultural gain of everybody, including the foundations and the estates. Now, I am saying this is very few times happens, but there are still some little hints of this, including copyrights, which in these cases, these organizations act like I have the copyright, and basically slow, I think, not only conservators, but art historians, publications, and dissemination of actual new information. I am quite certain I am not the first conservator in this crowd who noticed the material or technique which the estate or the foundation hasn't known about. It's quite obvious, and I agree that if these things are not being supported, it becomes everybody's loss.
Let's open it up to the audience.
Since we're talking about authority, I guess, I was glad to hear you talk about the Lauren Clay incident, because it did get a lot of press. It caught my attention. I do wonder, though, about some larger issues, and I'm also glad that you brought up copyright, because the desire to protect the work and the desire to speak for the work and to speak for the best outcome for the work is not necessarily going to be a desire that is going to have great outcomes in certain situations. So in one hand, this one person or one estate or one group who is trying to protect the work may also be closing down a certain dialogue.
Yes.
And so what you were talking about, the work living in the world, there are very often competing authorities. And I guess I would like to, I don't know, throw that out there, that the idea that we all are in a shared game, maybe it's not quite such a pretty picture.
Well, I think that it's like looking through a telescope through the wrong end. And I think that's what I was doing, and that was my naivete. Because it's that idea of protection of something that's very important to you. Maybe, I think, and what happened was the naivete was not in what I believe, because I still believe it. The naivete was in how it would be interpreted, reinterpreted, and the impact that it would have. And and also the kind of shock that I had that Lauren Clay chose to kind of use the situation in a way that also changed, in my perspective, the dialogue from what I had thought it was. And so there was never an issue of censorship. There was never an issue of kind of trying to suppress an artist. But I think it started because we didn't have a proper process. It really was the phone call to Vaga that was the wrong move, turned out to be the wrong move. And I think, to Virginia's point, and other people have made this as well, the whole idea of copyright and protecting images and all that is really outdated, I think, in some way. So it's that I was a little behind that curve of understanding that, this should be expansive. I should have called up Lauren Clay and said, I'd love to meet you, instead of calling Vaga and saying, we don't want little mini replicas of David Smith with his titles on them. The next thing, someone's going to commission 20 of them in a gift shop and in a museum, and we don't want people to have that as their first experience of David Smith and think that it is a David Smith even. But that's kind of almost an old way of thinking, because people don't experience the world in that kind of focused, specific, analog way of this little object, that little object. So it was a really just unfortunate experience. I don't know if I kind of addressed your point, but.
Can I just interrupt a little? I think it probably happened because you were perceived as the estate, the absolute authority. And I think there are still traces of this perception that whoever is the board of the foundation or the heir of the estate is the absolute authority. I would like to ask you, Virginia, how much it is true in real actual practice, because my perception and how I see a number of foundations which I think really providing all kinds of opportunities to everyone to contribute to the so-called legacy we are talking about is much more democratic, and it's much more of a discussion type. But I do see it in a number of places where the board of the foundation or the heir is really perceived as still as an absolute authority. And they try to control sometimes actually what is happening. We have a number of examples where they were not happy with published books and art historical articles and all kinds of other things. So I think there are still traces of these, and this is probably part of the problem we should discuss here, because what this symposium is going about and we are talking about, it's a different line and it's a completely different opening to the future.
Yeah,
And
one of us
what
was,
helps
when we were
everybody.
talking earlier, said the sort of what we want this to be is part of a shift in perception of foundations from a place that grants a permission or doesn't to one that collaborates, right? And
Yes.
it's completely different shape
Yes.
of
Yes.
that animal.
And I can bring wonderful examples for foundations. I think Derek didn't emphasize enough that the Gabo Trust is giving significant grants for conservators, specifically objects people, but basically everybody else.
Yeah.
I am
Yeah.
one of the happy
Beneficiaries, yeah.
beneficiaries of the traveling grant.
Yeah.
And then Liechtenstein Foundation announced that they are actually using technical experts, which is basically conservators, for their catalog raisonné, which is absolutely
Great.
brilliant.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of very good examples which are happening. It's just we have to work together as a body that it becomes the absolute normal. And I think the Hans Arp Foundation is actually giving out grants if you are interested doing something in art. These are wonderful opportunities, and I'm hoping all of this is on the website. I know the Gabo has it on the website. So we can actually take advantage of all of these.
Yeah.
I would like to address the legal authority, a question just so that we don't leave misconceptions hanging out in there. I mean, if your answer, I think there are two parts to your question. One is the copyright part, and the other part is related to copyright, the moral rights part, the part that would let you actually say it should be painted, not you shouldn't show an image of it or you have to come to me, for the image. Well, it is different in the US and other places to a very great extent, and I unabashedly feel very patriotically that the US version of law in both of these areas is the better law. US copyright law has a long duration that allows copyright of images of artwork or the design of an artwork for the life of the artist, and there are nuances and technicalities, of course, but generally the life of the artist plus 70 years. So the estate and the foundation after the artist's death may or may not be the copyright owner, okay? That's a very big point.
And if they are?
If they are, they have copyrights, which are a limited monopoly to use the work and images of the work for certain things. Fair use, a doctrine which I hope everybody has heard of, is the constitutionally baked in, like in the Constitution, provision that our copyright law always allows us to use other people's created works for the public good. Because the American theory of culture, rather differently from more romantic versions in other jurisdictions, is that we build on the works of other people. This should be a very familiar concept in this room, okay? And so we're always for more creativity, enabling more creativity. So suppressing images or censoring images, censoring documentation, requiring people to sign an NDA before they can help you restore a work, just kind of doesn't really even make any sense when you think about the bigger picture of what we're engaged in. Now, I also mentioned earlier that the moral right dies with the artist, but this is very different, let's say in France, okay? They're an heir who may or may not be an expert in the work, may or may not be an artist or an art historian or whatever, can say things like, that's no longer the work. I mean, that should be a really strange concept to us in this room. Who on earth, once the artist is dead, should have any moral right to say it's the work or not the work anymore, as long as there is our community knowledge of what the work is supposed to be, back to the Ponza collection and that type of research. So the only way we can really preserve the artist's voice into the future is by disclosure, more information, in my view.
Great. Maybe two questions, one here, and Christian, maybe ending?
Mine is not really a question, it's more of a comment, because the last thing I thought I would hear in this panel is anything having to do with insurance. Didn't seem to fit with everything else, and having been 30 years involved in the fine art insurance industry as a manager of the whole portfolio of the Chubb Group and on the board of AXA Art, now that I'm retired, I just never thought that insurance would ever be the authority of what can or cannot be done with an artist's work in the event of damage. And I know the insurance industry is not a monopoly, and every company has their own attitude about how they do things, but I think there are some things that are sort of go across, and that is really to respect the artist. It's not the decision that insurance companies, in my experience, and I've worked with many artist foundations and estates, personally underwriting them, and also at the same time, when there was damage and it was deemed to be a total loss, to give it to the foundation or the estate so they can study the work and see how the artist constructed it and so forth, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. But I think in defense of the industry, and unless there are specific, there's always outliers and things that happen out there. But I think the insurance industry is not the one who's going to be making the decision about what something is worth. They work with the conservators, they work with the artist estate, they work with the art historians in order to decide whether something is a total loss or not. And frequently there's a lot of pressure from collectors to deem something to be a total loss for their own interest. And that is a very hard thing to overcome. But I think overall, I think we're doing the right thing in trying to get all the stakeholders out there to make sure that we're doing the right thing and not violating, you know, either whatever authority there is, or making decisions on our own as to, you know, how to end up, and that there's no special interest. Yes, people don't like to pay total losses, but this is what we have to face when it needs to be done, and if it can be restored, I know that we're more than happy that the work can be restored and preserved. So maybe it's an apology for the insurance industry. I'm kind of surprised to hear that there are issues that make the insurance industry the one that sort of creates part of the market issues.
Well, I'm really glad you spoke up, because first of all, I want to be sure that it's clear that my comment was specifically in the context of NDAs. Okay, that insurance companies are, in my experience, which I think includes every art insurer, they are a primary driver of confidentiality agreements and non-disclosure agreements, whether it's through the private collector or through the auction house. And I'm anti-NDA in this context, is basically what I'm saying. But that said, and this is not meant as an attack on the insurance industry in any way, because of the silos of information, you can wind up in situations where different insurance companies will pay out or not differently on what is the same type of damage to different kinds of work. And that changes the canon of that artist's work rather dramatically. So there is a market factor in which insurance absolutely plays a role. And if that has a negative effect, we can eliminate that by stopping the silence. And that's the point I wanted to make. So thank you very much for speaking up.
Well, I mean, I just want to speak about private practice in general. And we are often faced with the perception of that conservation means that something is wrong with an artwork, which I totally understand, and we totally respect, especially in a vibrant art market. We respect this protection. There are, however, a few estates who think that conservation in general is wrong and would undermine the statue of the body of work, and they would, and I mean, sometimes we want to share some detailed professional information at conferences, and these conferences are usually very helpful for developing the field of conservation, and we would not speak about specific objects, but we will speak in general about these problems. But we had, and I think Mareike wanted to speak about this, we had some issues where an estate said, no, we don't want you to go to this conference because we don't want anyone to know, which I understand in a way. Like, there are some artists who are almost, almost like more famous for their problems rather for their for their artistic creation, and I think we have to keep the balance. But yes. I truly support Nora when she says When I spoke to everybody at the panel, I said, let's not complain, but just let's speak about the good things that conservation can do, and I think we can greatly contribute to the research and to the better understanding of contemporary art, which I think that's why we are here.
Yeah, I agree with you because, yes, I do know that these things are still happening. However, I have a recommendation for estates and foundations, which I think is really simple and no cost. What brilliant idea for them. If you need a conservator, don't use the heir's daughter who knows somebody. Ask even just a librarian to go online and do a library research. And if you just punch in the keywords, several conservators will come up with peer-reviewed articles. You just have to see who did the most. And after that, my idea is, I think it's really wise for long term to pick 3, 5, or even 7, but 3 to 5 is perfect, of these people, asking them if they would be willing to volunteer to form a conservation advisory board for you. I am sure that there are a lot of really big-name conservators who would be happy to do that. And in that case, you don't have one single conservator's opinion. You will have a much more objective body to decide. It's similar what we do today here, the body, to decide and to help you generally in conservation. It is really working out very well in a few places where it happens. And it really doesn't cost anything to any estate and any foundation.
Great ending for the day. We're happy to stick around for a few more questions, but it's getting late. So thank you panelists, thank you everybody. Thank you.